After a heart-wrenching breakup, Melissa decided it was time to let go of the past, including the exquisite ring her ex had given her. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. With a heavy heart, she walked into a renowned jeweler's shop, hoping to part with the ring and maybe get some money in return. As the jeweler took a closer look, his eyes widened in disbelief. The man, Mr. Harris, gasped as he looked back up at Melissa. "Wait here, I'll be right back," he said, as he disappeared into a back room, taking the ring with him. Melissa was left alone at the counter, and she was a bit confused by the jeweler's reaction. She had owned this ring for a couple of years now, and she never noticed anything very special about it. She looked around the shop as she listened to the sounds coming from the back office, where Mr. Harris appeared to be rummaging through some drawers. She heard him muttering something, and she assumed that he was just talking to himself, but she couldn't understand what he was saying. "Is everything all right?" she asked him, wondering if she should have gone to a different shop instead. Mr. Harris replied, Yes, I'll be right there." Just checking something, she sighed and stayed at the counter, waiting for him to return. She still had no idea of the shocking discovery she was about to make. Minutes later, she heard Mr. Harris say, "Aha, there it is," and soon after, she heard footsteps coming closer and closer and closer until he finally reappeared on the doorstep again. He was holding something in his hands, a piece of paper. Melissa assumed that that was what he had been looking for. He scored, but she didn't understand what it had to do with her ring. She tried to get a better look at it, but Mr. Harris had folded the paper in half, so she couldn't see what was on it. "Miss Melissa, I hope you don't mind, but I have to ask you a personal question," he told her. She nodded, and he asked, "Where did you get this ring?" Melissa blushed, but she didn't know if that was because of the memory of her ex or the accusing tone in Mr. Harris's voice. "My ex-boyfriend gave it to me a few years ago," she replied. She explained that they weren't together anymore and she thought it was time to get rid of this ring. "Very well, I see," Mr. Harris replied, as he scratched his head. "Do you happen to know where he got this ring?" Melissa shook her head and told him she had always assumed he had bought it at a jewelry store. She never thought to ask him where he had bought her present. That would be very odd, she thought to herself. "Well, I actually need to discuss this with a colleague before I can buy it from you. They are on their way here right now. It shouldn't take long until they get here. Would you like a cup of coffee or tea while you wait?" Melissa was a little bit caught off guard because of this, but she replied, yeah, sure. Why not? She thought it probably wasn't that weird for jewelers to ask for a second opinion in these situations, and she thought he surely wouldn't do that if he didn't think the ring was worth a lot of money. She became excited at this thought, and suddenly, she didn't mind staying a bit longer in the shop at all. She enjoyed her tea while dreaming about ways to spend the money, thinking that she was waiting for Mr. Harris's colleague. However, she had no idea that it was not a colleague he had called. A couple of other people came into the shop and looked around or even bought something before leaving again. Melissa was lost in thought when she heard the bell ring again, signaling that another customer had entered the shop. She didn't look up to see who had walked in this time, and that was why she hadn't seen that it was a police officer. So, as suddenly she heard Mr. Harris say, "Thank you so much for coming right away." "That's her right there," as he pointed to Melissa. She was surprised and she didn't understand what was happening for a moment, and then she finally noticed the man in the police suit. As the officer walked over to her and said, "Ma'am, I'm afraid you have to come to the station with me." And Melissa couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What? Me? Why? I haven't done anything," she exclaimed. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, and if she explained it to them at the station, they would have to believe her. Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she followed the cop to his car and took a place in the back seat. She wiped her tears and tried to calm herself down, but that was difficult, seeing as she had no idea what was going on. The officer suddenly said, "We're here," and he turned off the car engine. Melissa looked out of the window and she saw that they had arrived at the police station. The officer got out of the car and opened the door for her, and he said, "Follow me." Yep, Melissa did as he asked, and he led her to an interrogation room at the back of a dark hallway. "Wait here," he said, and he closed the door, leaving her alone and stuck in this room. The man said, "Hi, Melissa. I'm Officer Davis. I see you've already met my colleague, Officer Johnson. Now I want you to tell us about that ring." Of course, Officer Davis had no idea that his colleague had never properly introduced himself to Melissa, but that isn't important right now. What really shook Melissa was the last thing the officer said, mentioning the ring. So that's what this is all about, she thought. "The ring?" Melissa asked, full of disbelief. "What about the ring?" "I told Mr. Harris everything already," she said. "Well, we want you to tell it again, but this time to us." "Where did you get it?" Officer Davis asked. "Well, my ex-boyfriend gave it to me right before he cheated on me with my best friend." "When did he give it to you? Do you know where he bought it?" he asked Melissa. She said, "No, I have no idea." He never told me and I never cared enough to ask. Can someone please tell me what is going on? I don't even want that stupid ring anymore." Officer Davis took a deep breath, glancing at Officer Johnson before turning his attention back to Melissa. "We understand this is confusing, and we owe you an explanation," he began. "The ring you possess isn't just any ordinary piece of jewelry." And Melissa leaned forward, her anxiety evident. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her eyes darting between the two officers. Officer Johnson took over. "That ring, Melissa, is an artifact with deep historical roots. It's not just valuable because of the gems or the metal, but because of its history." Melissa's eyes widened in surprise. "It's been passed down through generations, representing a lineage of power and wealth. Its monetary value is immense, but its historical significance is even greater." Davis interjected, "The reason we're involved is that this ring was reported stolen from the Metropolitan Museum 2 years ago." As the officers continued explaining the ring's significance, a memory flashed in Melissa's mind. She remembered Steve's odd reaction when she'd once asked about the ring's origin. His evasiveness, the way he'd quickly changed the subject, it all began to make sense. Could Steve be involved? She wondered aloud, her voice tinged with disbelief. Melissa hesitated, then began recounting certain incidents. There were times when Steve would disappear without explanation. He had a small collection of antiques, always vague about their origins, and she recalled a particular evening when he'd come home, a triumphant gleam in his eyes, clutching a small box, the same box that held the ring. Gathering her courage, Melissa looked the officers in the eyes. "I think Steve knows more than he ever let on. If Steve is involved, we need to approach this carefully," Officer Davis murmured. The room was thick with tension as they began to strategize. "We need a confession, something concrete," Officer Johnson stated. "What if we set up a meeting? Wire Melissa, get her talk to Steve. And see if he spills anything." Officer Davis pondered the idea, weighing the risks. Melissa felt a whirlwind of emotions. The thought of facing Steve, especially under these circumstances, was daunting, but she knew the importance of the situation. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "I'll do what she said," determination evident in her voice. "But we need to ensure everything goes smoothly." The officers nodded in agreement, appreciating her bravery. Officer Davis cleared his throat, his face grave. "Melissa, you need to understand the risks involved. If Steve is indeed connected to the theft, he might become defensive or even aggressive." Melissa swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of the situation. "We'll be monitoring every second," ready to intervene, Officer Johnson added, trying to offer some reassurance. "But you'll be walking a tightrope in a dimly lit room." Melissa was introduced to a range of surveillance equipment. A technician carefully fitted her with a concealed microphone and an earpiece, ensuring they were discreet yet functional. The officers gathered around Melissa, maps and communication devices spread out on the table. "We'll have officers stationed outside and inside the venue. Each at the first sign of trouble, we'll move in," Officer Johnson detailed. Officer Davis added, "Trust your instincts, Melissa, and remember, we've got your back." Melissa nodded, taking one last deep breath as she prepared to face her past. With trembling fingers, Melissa typed out a message to Steve. "Hey, it's been a while." Fancy catching up over a drink, she hesitated for a moment before hitting send. The weight of the situation pressed on her, but she knew she had to move forward. The message was out and the ball was now in Steve's court. Didn't take long. Almost immediately, her phone buzzed with a new message. "Mel, I've been thinking about you. Would love to catch up." When and where Melissa could sense Steve's enthusiasm even through the text. Clear he was eager, maybe even hopeful, about their reunion. Melissa pondered for a moment. She needed somewhere familiar, somewhere they'd shared memories. How about O'Alley's? 8 p.m. she typed. The bar held significance for them. It was where they celebrated anniversaries and shared countless dates. It would be the perfect setting to make Steve feel at ease. As the hours ticked by, Melissa's anxiety grew. She practiced her lines, went over the plan, and tried to anticipate Steve's reactions. She changed her outfit multiple times, aiming for the perfect balance of casual and put together. Every time she thought of the impending confrontation, her heart raced. She had to stay calm and focused. Unbeknownst to the regular patrons, OY Collies had some additional visitors that evening. Officers Davis and Johnson, along with a few undercover colleagues, discreetly took positions around the bar. They had a clear view of Melissa's table and ensured all exits were covered. They were ready, waiting for the scene to unfold. It deemed a dim lighting of O'Alley's cast a nostalgic glow as Melissa spotted Steve at the bar. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of the situation faded. They hugged, and Steve's familiar scent brought back a flood of memories. "It's been too long," Steve remarked, his voice tinged with genuine warmth. Melissa smiled, her heart pounding not from affection but from the gravity of her mission. "It really has," she replied, her voice steady. They chatted about work, friends, and the latest movies, with Melissa laughing at his jokes and sharing stories, all the while playing the part of the interested ex-girlfriend. In their covert positions, Officers Davis and Johnson listened to every word exchanged between the pair. As the evening wore on, Melissa began to artfully steer the conversation. Remember the gifts we used to give each other? Like that beautiful ring you gave me, she said, her voice casual. Steve's eyes flickered briefly, but he responded, "Ah yes, that was a special one." Melissa probed further. "Where did you find such a unique piece?" The ambience of the bar, the familiarity of their banter, and perhaps the drinks had Steve feeling more relaxed. He leaned in closer, a hint of the old intimacy returning. "It's a long story," he began, his guard lowering. Taking a deep breath, Steve finally spoke. "I didn't buy it. I took it." His eyes met Melissa's, filled with a mix of regret and desperation. "It was a mistake, a moment of madness. I thought it would impress you, show you how much I cared." He looked down, waiting for her reaction. But before Melissa could respond, the calm ambience of the bar was shattered. The doors burst open with a loud bang, causing other patrons to turn in shock. Officers, with badges gleaming, it swiftly moved through the bar. "Steve Thompson, you're under arrest," Officer Davis declared, handcuffing him. The bar was filled with murmurs and gasps as Steve, still in shock, was led away, realizing the gravity of his confession. Yet the bar's atmosphere grew thick with tension. Steve's face turned a shade paler, his eyes widening in disbelief. "That wasn't a confession, it was just..." Talking, he stammered, his voice quivering. Desperation was evident in his eyes as he looked around, seeking an ally, a way out. "You can't just arrest me based on a conversation," he exclaimed, his voice echoing in the now silent bar. Officer Johnson, with a stern expression, produced a small playback device. "Your words, Steve," he said, pressing play. The room filled with Steve's voice, detailing the theft of the ring. Alongside the recording, photographs of the stolen ring matched with museum documentation were laid out. The weight of his actions bore down on Steve. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging. Okay, he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I did it. I took the ring, thinking it would change everything for us." He looked up at Melissa, seeking understanding, but was met with a gaze of disappointment and hurt. Melissa stood at a distance, her heart heavy. A storm of emotions raged within her, relief that the truth had surfaced. My anger at Steve's audacity, and a deep-seated sadness for the love they once cherished. She had yearned for closure, but the unfolding events brought a complexity of feelings she had anticipated. The flashing lights of the police car cast a blue hue on the bar's exterior. Officers guided Steve, now handcuffed, towards the vehicle. Inside the stark, cold interrogation room at the police station, Steve sat across from Officers Davis and Johnson. "It was years ago," he began, his voice shaky. "I thought the ring would be my ticket to a better life." He detailed the planning, the execution, and the aftermath of the theft. The room seemed to blur as Steve's story transported them back in time. The museum, grand and imposing, was silent in the dead of night. Steve, equipped with tools and driven by desperation, had bypassed security systems with surprising skill. Back in the present, Steve's eyes glistened with tears. "I never imagined the weight this ring would carry," he admitted, his voice choked with emotion. "It wasn't just about the money or impressing Melissa. It became a chain, a constant reminder of the wrong I'd done." Melissa, in another room, recounted her side of the story. She spoke of the gift, her ignorance of its true origin, and the eventual realization of Steve's crime. "I never suspected," she said, her voice firm yet tinged with sadness. But after the whirlwind of events, Melissa found herself back at the jewelry store. Mr. Harris, the jeweler who had recognized the stolen ring, greeted her with a warm smile. "I've been in this business for decades," he said, "and that ring's story was well known in our circles." "Thank you, Melissa, for playing a pivotal role in bringing closure to this long-standing mystery." Quiet moments at home gave Melissa time to reflect. The entire ordeal had been a crash course in trust and intuition. She realized that ignoring red flags, especially in relationships, could lead to unforeseen consequences. "Trust your gut. It's used," she'd often tell herself, thinking back to the time she'd felt something was off with Steve but had brushed it aside. Determined not to let the past define her, Melissa made a conscious decision to move forward. She began attending therapy, where she processed her feelings about Steve's betrayal and the media's attention. Slowly, she rebuilt her life, focusing on her own well-being and happiness, leaving the shadows of the past behind. Her single life became an adventure filled with new experiences and discoveries. Each day was a step away from the drama and a stride